Hello and good afternoon, everyone. I'll give people a minute or so just to file in and then we'll begin. Well, I'll start at this point. My name's Alan Carson. I'm a neuropsychiatrist based in Edinburgh, speaking to you from a rather cold but rather wonderful day up here in the north. And it's a real pleasure to be invited on behalf of the neuropsychiatry faculty to speak in this series of webinars celebrating 180 years of the college and its predecessor. I was asked if I could speak about the history of functional disorders, and since I'm always happy to bore for Britain on this topic, that didn't take much persuasion. So without further ado, we'll get started. And the first question whenever one's looking at a history is, what actually are you taking a history of? What is the unit of study here? Is it the idea of hysteria? Is it the shift in concept over time? What are we at? And what I'm really going to approach this from is the idea that there have always been, and I'll show you evidence for why I think this, a group of patients who have symptoms which are incompatible with the normal rules of disease. And to illustrate what I'm meaning by that, this is an example of somebody who might come to my outpatient clinic with what's called a tubular visual field, complaining of restricted vision. The patient I've got at the moment with this problem is registered blind, so they're highly disabled by it. But when we measure their fields, whether it's at bedside to confrontation or whether we use more formal field measures, we find that they have a pattern that's not compatible with the rules of disease. So if you have retinal pathology, if you think back to your O-grade physics or O-level, you'll remember that going through a lens, any field defect must be conical. This sort of tubular pattern can't exist. Or if you're measuring their fields to perimetry, you can often get these non-physiological components, a so-called spiral field, where it shrinks every time you go round, showing an internal inconsistency. And that's what I'm really getting at. It's a group of symptoms that break the rules of disease, and patients simultaneously show an ability and an inability to function. It's not about symptoms that we don't know their cause. In the world of neurosciences, that we see plenty of patients where we haven't got a clue what's wrong with them, but they've got some horrible brain disease. It's about a group of patients where we're fairly confident in saying this is not caused by some structural or known physiological lesion. So starting at the beginning, I'm going to borrow heavily from the work of Ted Reynolds. Ted, many of you may know, he worked for most of his career at King's College, London, where he's a very well-respected neurologist there, working alongside David Marsden and others. But he's had a long-term interest in the history of neurology, written very well on this topic, often in conjunction with Kinnear Wilson, I think it's the son or the grandson of the great neurologist. And I've lent quite heavily on Ted, particularly for the ancient period, which I'll self-confess that I know less about. But when I was a trainee, we were kind of taught that the earliest mentions, really in written medicine, of any disorder were of hysterical disorders. And Egyptian papyri, particularly the Kahun papyrus, is often cited as one of the earliest medical documents. And it was supposedly a series of cases of hysterical causation in which a wandering uterus was causing a range of neurological symptoms. This was really popularized by the medical historian Vieth in her work on the history of hysteria. I think most people would now take the view, however, that there were problems in the original translation of this papyrus. The original Griffith translation is generally considered to have many errors, and most people defer to a much later German translation by Glapau, which is seen as superior. And essentially, the papyrus itself is very plain. It just contains prescriptions for 34 cases. There's no mention of mechanism whatsoever. A lot of the unguents used were certainly applied to vulval areas, but most of the prescriptions were actually of pelvic pain, so that's not a surprise. Only 8 were of remote areas. And I think the general feeling is that Vieth's interpretation of this was fanciful and made in retrospect. The other great sort of era of ancient medicine was Babylonian. We know a lot more about Babylonian medicine because they tended to write on stone tablets, so much more of it survived, but there were simply no mentions of anything that would look like what we would now call a functional disorder in Babylonian medicine. It's really when you get to Greek medicine that you start to see any mentions of this idea of a wandering uterus. And even then, as far as the medical corpus goes, it's fairly light stuff. Vieth in her book cites 2 cases. The wife of Polymarchus felt a sudden pain in her groin, her menses having failed to set in. She was out voiced through the entire night until the middle of the next day, and only able to indicate with her hand that the pain was in her groin. Now, it's possible that this was pain-induced globus hystericus, but I think you've got to say one's going out on rather a limb to interpret it in that way. Similarly, the second case she cites possibly has more suggestion of a functional disorder, a short insignificant cough. There's a paralysis of the right upper limb and the left lower limb, but no paralysis of the face, no effect on cognition that suddenly improved after 20 days. And it's difficult to necessarily think of some disorder that would fit with that. But notably, there's no mention of uterine involvement in this case. These are the mainstays she found as evidence in the Hippocratic canon, but I think it's quite weak. There was one other mention that the historian Simon found, and that is if a woman suddenly becomes voiceless, she will find her legs cold as well as the knees and the hands. And if you then palpate the uterus, it's not in its proper place. Her heart palpates, she gnashes her teeth, there is copious sweat, and all the other features characteristic of those who suffer from the sacred disease epilepsy. And they do all sorts of unheard things. This is potentially more explicit, although one of the problems was that in this time, uterine prolapse was by no means unknown. And it's difficult to know whether we were looking at the ordinary effects of uterine prolapse, as Mirsky and Potter have argued in their critique of Vieth's interpretations, or whether this is truly about a wandering uterus. There's actually more evidence from the philosophers, certainly in Plato's dialogues. It is quite unambiguous that when remaining unfruitful long beyond its proper time, the uterus gets discontented and angry and wandering in every direction through the body, closes up the passages of breath, and by obstructing respiration, drives them to extremity, causing all variety of disease. So I think certainly these are maybe more reasonable conclusions to come to. And obviously there was a clear interaction between the philosophers and the physicians of the era. So it may well be that people are entitled to interpret the Hippocratic canon, Hippocratic canon, that's my words suddenly working, correctly, but I think it is ambiguous. I think what one certainly sees, though, is from the very earliest element, stories emerging. People have an idea and a belief that this was about the wandering uterus. And I think it's not unreasonable to suggest that historians have gone and sought evidence to confirm their belief rather than looking at things in a position of equipoise and trying to decide. And we see this idea of stories emanating, and they're certainly taken hold. It's in popular culture. If I go and ask my wife or my daughter or son, they will have heard of this original idea of hysteria being caused by a wandering womb. But there's actually not that much evidence that anyone medical has ever thought that. What did undoubtedly start in Greek medicine was the start of what Ted Reynolds and others would refer to as natural medicine. And this was really the idea that our emotional life comes from the brain. Prior to that, and even through that, and the ideas of Aristotle, etc., there was very much a view that the heart was the seat of life. A lot of that seemed to come from work on embryos and dissecting things like birds' eggs and seeing the heart as the first clearly beating object. It's assumed that was the seat of the soul. And the brain was kind of thought of as some sort of radiator for coolant purposes. But really we see this transition through Greek medicine to an idea that it has some control over our thoughts and our feelings. And that starts, I think it's fair to say that through the age, the idea that the majority of our thoughts, feelings, personality were dominated by our relationship with our gods and ancestors. But we get this first creep of the idea that psyche might be more complex. And the word psyche, where we obviously as a college have our roots in, is a complex word that I don't think really translates. It certainly doesn't mean psychological in the way we would currently understand the word, but nor does it quite mean soul either. I would sort of suggest that it's a sort of mind soul, that we don't really have a direct equivalent, but there's this idea of this relationship between religion, bodily entity, and the idea that thoughts, feelings, desires have a sort of teleological component, a direct relationship to God. And we start to see that played out over time. By the time we get to Roman medicine, it's certainly pretty clear that the uterine hypothesis has taken root. And the works of Aristeas the Cappadocian, often well known for his original descriptions of melancholy, are quite explicit about that. And I don't think that that's so open to doubt. There were a few detractors. The rather unfortunately named Soranus, who was an early gynecologist, happened to point out that we seem to get similar afflictions in men, and wasn't that a problem? But in general, the Roman orthodoxy of the day, particularly championed by Galen, who in many ways was a very enlightened man for his time, said it's not possible because men didn't have uteruses, which is as nice an idea of post hoc ergo propter hoc as you're likely to come across. We then go into the Dark Ages, where far less is really known about what was thought about this condition. And a lot of the ideas get connected with medieval miracles and witchcraft. And I think one has to treat with caution, because I think all sorts of things were going on, particularly with the idea of miracles, to what extent this was simply about building up the commercial viability of your church or your temple or your saint and relics. On witchcraft, where jealousy and punitiveness came in versus genuinely mistaking functional disorders. This is from some unpublished work we've conducted, led by Laura McWhirter, an excellent colleague of mine, and in combination with Irene Metzler, a historian who has done a lot of study on medieval disability. And she'd managed to find a range of texts across England and continental Europe from 7th to 13th century describing miracles, and translated them into English. And working at them, we've been through them, really just trying to find out, are there any in which you would say, look, this does sound like a functional symptom, as opposed to just a miraculous cure or a con. And I think there are some. Paper will hopefully come out soon, but here are just a few examples. For instance, 3 narratives describe a contortion of the hand, such that the fingers dig into the palm. And that's really a very unusual symptom in anything other than a fixed dystonia, which is a functional problem. You tend not to get it in any other form of neurological disease. And it's not an obvious one to choose for falsification, would suggest. So we did wonder if this was genuinely getting towards functional disorders. And also unilateral facial weakness with the mouth twisted back, or as one put it, wrenched backwards towards one ear. Functional facial disorders are actually far more common than people realize, but they're not really paralysis, although they initially look like that. So they're often mistaken for acute stroke, but actually what you're getting is contraction of platysma, so that the face kind of drags down and across. It's really a form of facial dystonia, very rare in any other condition. And again, one just wonders if it tends to suggest something true. Whereas things like under the issues, tears turned to blood, which flowed down in waves, lay in red clots on the ground, and tiny sparks of light began to light her eyes. This just sounds more fanciful. So I think, again, the idea that all witches and all miracle seekers had functional disorders that were going undiagnosed is simply wrong. It's a story. But there are probably some functional patients mixed up in the general melee of that story, but how much and how often, I think is very hard to say. We move through into the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And I think in general, this period is characterized by a gradual shift towards thinking of functional disorders as conditions of the brain originally, particularly under the influence of people like Thomas Willis, who thought that there was little microclots in the capillaries. Does that echo for anything we've heard recently? And then going on to people like Sydenham, who were starting to tease with the idea that this was maybe a disorder of the mind. I think most people, particularly in the early half of this period, tended to shy back from going too close to the mind, because that was still very much the preserves of priests and of religion. And people were just a little bit cautious about how close to that they wanted to push. I think Sydenham got quite close in his writings. He wrote very eloquently in a series of letters to a rural physician, Dr. Cole. No one's quite sure who this Dr. Cole was, but one of the letters, he described the medical use of opiates, described malaria for the first time, and laid down most of his thoughts on hysteria, which were pretty sensible ideas. So yeah, it was a bit better than my standard clinic letter. And he was very much a medical colossus of his time. I love this book published posthumously, Complete Method of Curing Almost All Diseases. That's what you want to go down with as your medical textbook. But what we also see through this period is theories starting to emerge with the technology of the age. And I think this is a theme that's recurrent throughout. Whenever there is a new technology or a new scientific ideology, somebody approaches the study of functional symptoms in that regard. So it's looking at the development of electricity as people started to develop the concept of something called Faradism over time, of creating currents and applying them to rectify functional symptoms. And one sees this being visited recurrently. And the idea essentially was that a stimulus applied to the affected limb could re-induce movement. There's a number of ideas why that might be. I think what one generally saw, and again, it's a recurrent finding, is that I think these experiments did periodically work, and there's some quite convincing accounts of them doing so. But then people would make up a theory to fit with it that was within the scientific argot of the day. And I think arguably that hasn't changed. Oops, sorry, I seem to have jumped a slide, my apologies. And you can see that currently in functional disorders with the interest in transcranial magnetic stimulation, arguably the electricity of the day. And there is a debate raging as to its efficacy in treating functional disorders. Beatrice Gassan's group in Paris have led a lot of the research. doing fairly elegant studies. For those of you who are not familiar with transcranial magnetic stimulation, if you stimulate the contralateral motor cortex, you'll cause movement in the thumb. You'll get it to jerk, and it's a sort of slightly weird, slightly unpleasant feeling of just this autonomous movement of your hand and arm. Beardsley's group felt that most of the action was placebo, and what they would do was to induce similar action in the arm by stimulating further down in the neck. So we're not actually looking at cortical modulation. And they ascribe it a lot to Francine Mesrati, who's their neurophysiologist, who would really prepare the patients very well with a lot of sort of suggestion. And really, they were using this as an enabling device to reinstate movement. But Matt Burke and Tony Lang's group across in Canada presented some quite convincing evidence on basic and longitudinal neurophysiology that there maybe is some cortical modulation. But I think what we can mainly see is ideas that started in the 18th century of how does electrical stimulation work, continuing into current day. I'm not sure we're any closer to an argument. And both are embedded in the ideologies and scientific methodologies of their time. Similarly, around this time, Manchester Dr. James Baird started to experiment with hypnosis, and we had similar ideas that were almost certainly based on hypnotic principles being developed, famously by Anton Mesmer, but really scientifically espoused by Charles Deslon, with this idea that there was such a thing as animal magnetism. This was some sort of bodily substance in the air, again, very much in the scientific time of the discovery of gases that could be felt. It was a force field that people like Mesmer could manipulate. It reached quite a point where people were worried about exploitation and distortion of sciences. The French Academy held a committee of inquiry, more for Charles d'Esselon than for Mesmer. Mesmer was kind of chased out of town in his pajamas one night and had to disappear for fraud. But I think Charles d'Esselon definitely believed in what he was saying about these force fields. And he faced a committee chaired by Benjamin Franklin. Dr. Guillotine was on the panel. I mean, you wouldn't want that for your fitness to practice decision. But they actually did some quite hard science, including randomized controlled experiments in which the experimenters were literally blindfolded and asked to test the results. And they showed that really this was about suggestion rather than any true animal force. But out of the notions of hypnotism, we started to find some interesting ideas about will and action, and some really quite sophisticated ideas of etiology, where people were saying things like, it is not the muscles which do not obey the will, it is the will itself which does not enter into the action. Paget very famously is quoted as saying, she says I cannot, it looks like I will not, but it is that I cannot will. Within this is this idea that this is not so much a disorder of actually the motor tracts, but it's a disorder of the initiation of movement, where a corruption of voluntary movement occurs, such that people cannot act as they wish. Some, like Briquet, went on to suggest that there might be a sort of microclot explanation for this, in terms of paralysis might be to do with injection of capillary vessels in the nerve centers of the brain. And of course, that remains speculative, and one certainly does get conditions like alien hand syndrome, but they have a very distinctly different feel to the loss of functional control one gets in a functional disorder, and can be quite accurately separated out. But it's possible that this is functional corruption of similar areas. And indeed, recent functional imaging studies, this is from Patrick Villemel, who I think was one of the early pioneers of functional imaging in terms of study of functional symptoms, and just showing that simulation really produces the same connectivity patterns as normal movement. And that's no surprise. We know that even thinking about movement creates the typical motor stimulation. But there have been consistent findings in patients with functional disorders that there seems to be some disorder of the planning circuitry of normal movement, and also around feelings of agency further back in the temporoparietal junction. And that's a relatively consistent signal. I think it's a mistake to think that that's entirely explanatory and we know what it means, but it starts to give us some clues that map quite well on to careful observation of what patients are doing. We then find who, for me, up until 20th century, was really one of the heroes of the piece, Briquet, as we moved to Paris. And it's probably the golden era of hysteria research. Briquet, I think, compared to the sort of more dazzling lights at the Salpêtrière, was really one of the heroes of the piece. Relatively unsung, apart from Gouzet's attempts to rehabilitate his influence. But his treatise on hysteria is really a masterful piece of medical epidemiology, particularly for the age. But in fact, most of what he had to say still stands today. He'd created long cohorts. He looked at people epidemiologically. He had no preconceived ideas. His famous quote was, "Medicine has too many hypotheses and not enough facts." And what he showed were that there were certain predisposing factors towards this, but essentially, contrary to a lot of expectation of the day that these were disorders of sexual frigidity, that it was childhood experience, and particularly abusive experiences, aversive experiences of all type, but also overindulgent experiences could be bad for people. Overly anxious parenting may be equally harmful. He noted precipitants in terms of life events, illness, physical injury, overwork, and unexpected shock. It really was a masterpiece of the day. It's a shame he's so unknown. In fact, we don't actually even know his first name. Debate rages as to whether it's Paul or Pierre Briquet. He's buried in Paris, and Mai of Mercy My Fame sent me a photo of his birthing. It's just too obscure to actually understand anything other than the letter P, but this is well worth reading if you're interested. And then we move on to the Salpêtrière, and I think you get referred to the GMC nowadays if you do a lecture on the history of hysteria without showing this lithograph. It's become rather a cliche of Charcot's famous Leçon du Malvé. And it's difficult to know how to fully approach Charcot's contribution. He certainly had some ideas that were frankly erroneous about ovarian compression and clamps, and the notion you should push these. It's kind of tricky when you read his writing to know just how strongly he actually adhered to this, or whether it was just something to do. I think what he was, however, was a supreme clinical observer, and he really laid down, I would argue, an approach to neurological examination, to separating out functional disorders from other conditions that has undoubtedly stood the test of time. In some of his work, he was undoubtedly a showman, but that was what it was expected in that era. You know, people went to grand rounds to be entertained and enlightened, much the same as we do today. You know, no one likes to leave a lecture saying, God, that speaker was dull, he was probably quite worthy. You know, we like engagement, and there's no doubt Charcot was engaging. There would be queues of carriages all down the left bank in time for his clinical demonstrations. This was in an era where entertainment was light. You couldn't go and watch Netflix. So this was very much something to do. But again, I think we do need to be thinking of it, that to be seen and be seen in salons was part of Parisian culture of that era. Much of what he saw has been documented. I think we can be fairly clear-cut that the disorders he was describing are what we today would consider as functional, both recorded in drawings, but also in early use of photography. The question exists, however, as to what extent his models were simply acting and being taught to perform for the great man, or to what extent they had genuine symptomatology. There's certainly been quite a lot of revisionist action and criticism of Charcot, much of which I think is unfair. To put my cards on the mast over time, and these sort of books, Asti Husfeld, etc., are all fairly commonplace. The difficulty is, again, well, it depends on whose story you believe. So one of the chief accusers, if you like, of falsification was Jane Avril. She had been an intermittent patient at the Salpêtrière Hospital. She had really had a fairly tough life. Her mother was a prostitute who'd had an Italian aristocrat lover who'd been her father, who'd abandoned them following Jeanne Avril's birth. She'd been brought up in brothels around Paris. And although the details are scant, I think it's fair to imagine that they weren't great. She'd ended up at the Salpêtrière, apparently with a range of functional symptoms, which she said she falsified. She left after a failed romance with one of the medical staff, and there's certainly good evidence to suggest that there were what would be considered inappropriate relations between some junior staff and patients. I'm not aware of anything to suggest Charcot or the better known names were engaged in any of this. But she was certainly fairly vitriolic. This is her sort of famous quote: "It's all came down to who could find some novelty to eclipse her peers. A large group of students, preceded by Charcot, gathered around the patients' beds to watch their extravagant contortions, back arches, various acrobatics, and other gymnastics. Several of the women had romantic adventures with the students, which the living results became apparent after a few months. They were sent away during the necessary time for this sort of event. Then they'd come back, poor lost sheep, happy to return to the fold." Jon Avril, on leaving the Salpêtrière, went to achieve considerable fame and notoriety as a can-can dancer at the Moulin Rouge. And for those of you who enjoyed Nicole Kidman's role in the more recent film of the Moulin Rouge, she was loosely based, and I do mean loosely, around Jane Avril. Blanche Whitman, she is the woman who is the centerpiece of the famous mural He Received Wilting. Offered a very different view. Interviewed much later in the late 1950s, she was asked to explain what had happened and whether these accusations of falsification were true. And she said, "Well, what do you want to know?" "Well, they claim all the attacks were fake. Patients pretended to be asleep and the whole thing was a joke in the doctors. What's the truth in all of that? None of it's true. It's all lies. We fell asleep. We had attacks. It's because we were helpless to do otherwise. What's more, it's very unpleasant." And she added simultaneously, "Fakery. Do you think it'd be easy to fool Monsieur Charcot? Yes, there were tricksters who tried. We simply gave him a look that said, 'Be still.'" And as the writer of this piece said, that's how the confession of hysteric ended, the homage to the great deceased neurologist. I think, like everything in life, it depends whose story you choose to believe. Charcot was certainly very open that there were a number of patients falsifying symptoms. But I think on the whole, which is often forgotten, is that he took a group of people who'd had appalling lives, often living in great destitution. And I think he treated them with a degree of humanity at the Salpêtrière that was not often found elsewhere. And I think that's forgotten. It's easy to look back with a modern eye on the development of performance. But I think compared to the alternate choices available, this was a benign and I would say relatively humane regime that the Salpêtrière. As to whether they were faked or not, I don't think we can say. I think again it comes down to this idea of which story do you believe, and everyone has their narrative and can choose to believe what you wish. Blanche Whitman's story, as she got better, ended well. She ended up being a medical photographer at the Salpêtrière and went on to enjoyable life. But what is clear from this sort of documentation is that we are talking about the same group of symptoms. Malinescu documenting on hysterical paralysis, filming from around the same time in Paris, shows a gait phenotype that would be clearly recognizable to people today. Sorry, and we can see that from a range of historical photos, this externally rotated dragging gait, and this is from some of our own clinical patients with identical gait phenotype. So we know we're at least talking about the same thing. Charcot's disciples came to have their own fame. I think Yanni's work has particularly stood some of the test of time, not all his work, but some. Famous quote was that he was deemed for greatness. Everyone thought Yanni was going to be the great follow-up act to Charcot. Freud was a little bit of an outsider and wasn't really expected his star would shine so bright. As some put it, Yanni's shown us how, Freud why, and some tend to forget about the how. And Yanni's great contribution was the idea of dissociation, of compartmentalization of brain function so that ordinary integration was lost. Babinski, who's seen holding Blanche in that famous lithograph, who perfected a lot of his examination techniques. It's an interesting cartoon. It was taken from, roughly speaking, the Parisian equivalent of the Sun. So it's a popular newspaper, and the inscription's maybe not showing too clearly, but the cartoon line is "Ceci, c'est mon signe." It's a sort of play on the word signe for swan and sign. But we can see the fan illustrating, as we know in Babinski's reflex, not just the toe goes up, but the toes fan out. But I think it just illustrates how much interest there was in popular culture in medicine at the time. Babinski's own ideas were very much about the role of external suggestion. He thought that hysteria was a disorder of suggestion and that distorted ordinary planes of movement, very much embedded in the ideas of hypnosis, and really that the role was of external suggestion. We'll come back to the relevance of that in a minute. But it's Freud who everyone knows about, postulated the conversion hypothesis. The problem with Freud is actually so much of what he said is actually slightly lost in what people think he said. The conversion hypothesis stated by Freud really, I don't think, is what people think of as a conversion hypothesis now. His was very much about largely infantile thoughts and fantasies being repressed unconsciously, so they never entered a conscious mind, and that tension created into a physical symptom. I think more people are now talking about the suppression of thoughts and really interpersonal rather than interpsychic conflict. So really much more in keeping with an object relations school, a much later evolution of psychodynamic psychotherapy. But again, we've got the story of what we think Freud said rather than necessarily what he actually did. There's no doubt, however, and this is from Modern Systematic Review, led by Leah Ludwig from our group, that all forms of childhood aversive effects and adult aversive effects predispose to the development of functional symptoms. And I think that's beyond reasonable doubt now. It's interesting, of course, when people talk about a misogynistic culture, the patriarchy that sort of imposes these symptoms on women. But the alternate thought is women, sadly, are much more abused than men. And that may be a simple reason. And whether negating the reality of their symptoms is helpful or not, I think is very questionable. But it's not the whole story, because about a third of patients don't appear to have had such experiences. It doesn't explain why one patient gets a seizure, another paralysis, nor why an abusive experience 10 years ago starts on, say, the 1st of December 2018 or gets worse over time. So we do need to be aware of gaps that maybe need filled. Then came the war and shell shock, very much similar symptoms to functional disorders. But again, we start to see the use of story and narrative. It's from a paper we wrote on the use of cinematography in World War II. You can see German proponents on the top and English proponents, particularly Arthur Hurst's films on the bottom. This is supposedly showing the work of, oh God, his name's escaped me. Is it Private Noakes, Sergeant Noakes? I do apologize, I've probably given the wrong name. Anyway, this was him with a sort of camptocrimic-like presentation. And then later on, when he was cured a number of months later. But if you look closely at the backdrop, you can see the backdrop's identical in terms of the smoking car. And these films were clearly staged. And again, it's this idea of story and narrative. Now, defenders of Hirst, and I would tend to fall into this camp, would say that he was simply trying to recreate what he was doing clinically. And yes, it was somewhat staged, but no different to when I'm presenting somebody in a grand round and I ask them to tell me what it was like and what it's like now after treatment. But the answer is we will never go again, that there's elements of narrative and storytelling. And similarly to the war, we have this narrative in our mind of the military being psychiatrically incompetent during World War I and shooting people en masse who should have been diagnosed with shell shock. Actually, the military got to grips with shell shock at remarkable speed and were often very humane. Certainly in the first part of the war, people like Charles Myers, who were originally leading efforts in the Western Front, I mean, they were arranging to get people from theatre into psychologically enhanced rehabilitation within the UK within 48 hours. Try referring somebody to a discharge hub and getting something to happen in 48 hours in your local community psychiatric team and see how far you get. So it was certainly not the case that care was bad. In fact, it was often very enlightened and very sensible, but there was a tension, and the tension was the need to win the war and the issue of cowardice and nerves and keeping things going. Simon Wesley wrote very eloquently on this, entailing the tale of the life and death of Private Harry Farr, who was one of the few men actually shot for cowardice. It's worth noting how rare such things were. Of the 550 court-martials for cowardice that occurred and resulted in a guilty verdict, only 18 were actually executed, and no execution could take place until confirmed by the commander-in-chief, and generally they didn't get one. And Farr was one of the unlucky ones, and the question's rather why. There's certainly no much doubt about the facts, and Farr had struggled with the war. He'd been invalided out of the trenches for shell shock on 2 or 3 occasions. And prior to an advance, he simply said he felt unable to move forward to the trenches. His regimental sergeant major yelled at him, "You're a fucking coward. You go to the trench and give fuck all for my life and fuck all for yours, and I'll get you fucking well shot." So this was no atmosphere for blushing violets. But what is intriguing is that no one really stood up for Farr. It's quite unusual. He'd obviously upset his colleagues and comrades, and he was seen as being incapable. He probably didn't help himself. As he said, being withdrawn from the front line completely helped him. I don't want you to think I'm advocating shooting people for cowardice. I just feel so thankful that I'm neither there having to fight in the trenches. I suspect I might have behaved like Farr, or indeed having to make the decisions, because the great problem was how you kept morale going and this need to actually win the war. You couldn't have people opting out because they felt a bit anxious and didn't fancy it. Sensible though that might be. And you can see this in much of the debates. Here's Fairbairn and Arthur Hirst going at it in a 10-match knockout in the BMJ. With Fairbairn saying, really, we shouldn't be involving psychotherapy. It's really about just keeping morale high. And Hirst saying, no, my psychotherapy works. Fairbairn saying, well, it's a bit simplistic and basic. It really is quite a nice but ugly read that's well worth looking at. I better speed up a little. We can see Hirst's work. This is at Seal Hain, group of us meeting there. And his idea was that autosuggestion was part of the problem, and that a combination of suggestion and return, that the idea was symptoms were dependent on idea, and by strong idea of recovery, you could combat that, mixed often with a bit of electricity and Faradization. He certainly appears to have had a good rate of getting people back to the front. We then move forward and to what for psychiatry was certainly an interesting era under Elliot Slater, whose famous paper, Diagnosis of Hysteria, suggested anywhere between 60 to 80% of patients were misdiagnosed as follow-up. He concluded hysteria was a delusion and a snare, and really started off this idea that hysteria was an unreliable diagnosis and everyone ended up with some undiagnosed condition. if you actually read the paper, it has to be honest, it's very poorly written paper, very hard to understand the statistics and exactly what he's saying. What's also interesting is my colleague John and I published a paper just as a slight critique of his ideas. We've got a lot of letters from people who'd been house officers at Queen Square at the time, directly alleging that a lot of the results were falsified. And what was certainly happening at Queen Square was a fight between personalities. Slater, a big personality, and Sir Francis Walsh certainly did. Walsh is often described as a complex character. He was very suave, sophisticated, good-looking, and erudite, intensely cutting, and often cutting just for the sake of being cutting. And he and Slater had a poor relationship. Slater had been trying to have a chair bestowed and actually came with the money for it, but Walsh consistently vetoed it. And I think it's fair to say there was considerable personal dislike, and that probably influenced the creation of this paper. It's also fair to say that Walsh's dislike went beyond Slater, and he also vetoed chairs of neurology and neurosurgery. So he was certainly egalitarian in that approach. He felt that academic clinicians were like botanists who did all their study in a florist shop, free from any of the trappings of nature. It's interesting, but it had a defining effect, I think, on how hysteria was viewed, particularly in psychiatric circles over the next 40 to 50 years, but also to set a tone for neurological circles. This idea that really it wasn't the study of neurologists. This had quite a strong endorsement within Queen Square. As the war had gone on and casualties were mounting and shell shock was rising, the war office getting more and more concerned, and Gordon Holmes was put in charge. And Gordon Holmes essentially dealt with shell shock by just pretending it didn't exist. And ignoring it. And to a certain extent, that was the 20th century attitude to functional disorders in general. Similar, this is from Norman Dott archives, just giving us an idea of what went on. It wasn't all negative. Norman Dott, neurosurgeon in Edinburgh, kept copious notes and really just trying to say, look, we explained a kind of humane, benign approach, conditions not serious, try to pay less attention, but recognizing the validity of symptoms, no point in trying to persuade somebody it doesn't exist. And very pro-psychiatric. About 40% of their patients were referred to psychiatry, whereas when I did my MD, asking the same question of consecutive series of patients with functional symptoms, only 1% were referred. So interesting changes over time. But this sort of idea of ignoring it developed a story form with historians in particular, from paralysis to fatigue, the idea that these simply didn't exist. And when I was doing my membership, it was the correct answer to any question was they were rare, that these gross functional symptoms no longer existed, come to an end by the end of the 1930s. Michele, same thing. You'll see this throughout the historian's approach, that this just did not exist. But as Jan Benjin eloquently said, the contention that hysteria, now called conversion disorder, ceased to be common after Charcot's death makes it clear that Eagleton, the historian of the time, is not a neurologist. Oops, sorry, the slide's slightly in the wrong place, just dealing with the issue of misdiagnosis. There really is very little evidence of misdiagnosis. That we can be very robust now that the diagnosis error rate is around 1 to 2% on a long-term basis, as many as 14 years follow-up. This is the slide I thought I was going to show you. Sorry, I was just talking about numbers. In fact, when one reports, when we did Scottish Neurological Symptom Study, biggest epidemiological study in the field, we found about 6.5% of people had pure functional disorders. Charcot had said 8%. There's very little difference in rates over time and very little evidence to suggest any significant change. Again, it's a story that it declined. As this was going on, Samuel Guzzi was doing his work, setting up diagnostic criteria, clinical descriptions, laboratory studies, delineation from other disorders, follow-up studies, and family studies. And I think you could say the functional disorders ticks the box. We've got clear clinical description, we've got laboratory criteria, at least as far as tremor and movement disorder go. We clearly delineate from other disorders with follow-up studies, and there is a genetic link known. So we're making progress. What about patients? There's Oliver Sacks, one of the more famous patients to have such a disorder. He described an experience of paralysis following injuring his quadriceps running from a bull. And he describes it, I knew not my leg, utterly strange, not mine, unfamiliar. I gazed upon it with absolute non-recognition. The more I gazed at that cylinder of chalk, the more alien and incomprehensible it appeared to me. I could no longer feel it was mine as part of me. It seemed to bear no relation whatsoever to me. Absolutely not me, and yet impossibly attached to me, and even more impossibly continuous to me. What was becoming frightfully, even luridly clear was that whatever had happened was not the local, peripheral, superficial, terrible silence, the forgetting, the inability to call or recall, radical, central, fundamental. What at first seemed to be no more than a local peripheral breakage and breakdown now showed itself in a different, quite terrible light. It's a breakdown of memory, of thinking, of will, not just a lesion in my muscles, but a lesion in me. This sort of central idea of a breakdown took off from Sacks. Sacks hadn't thought this was a functional disorder, but when we wrote to him and said we thought it was, he kindly gave us permission to publish to that effect, which I thought spoke to great bravery on his part. But I think the problem was really he viewed a functional disorder in the old-fashioned hysterical term over paralysis caused by infantile problems, whereas when we're saying that we more think it's triggered by physical injury, we agreed we were really saying the same things, but in different words. In other words, we came to the problem with different stories. We enter the era of functional imaging, and expectations over time. People are building models now on the idea of top-down expectation. I'm going to skip this just in the interest of time, because I want to just finish on the idea of stories and the Cuban neurology of sonic attacks. You know, is this a sonic weapon as yet undiscovered, or were they a functional disorder? There's certainly little doubt that the only diagnosed problems in the survivors of these attacks, if that's the right word to use, is persistent postural-perceptual dizziness, which is a functional disorder. And that's certainly the finding of the American Academy of Sciences, although they don't actually make any comment to that effect. But we can see these narratives emerging, how we might consider this, and this tension between people want the idea that their diplomats could develop a functional disorder, or is that intolerable as an idea for the diplomats? But we can easily see, in terms of expectation and adaptation, how we can create de novo a functional disorder out of an expectation. So the sensation of dizziness when you go to make a movement, you make voluntary motion, your ears, your eyes, your musculoskeletal system make the motion, and they decide how much motion they've made. But you also have a corollary discharge with an efferent's copy, and you're checking that the reafferents and expected afferences match. And when you don't, you'll get vertigo. Now, most of the time, clinically in acute situations, we're looking at something disturbing, particularly the ears or maybe the eyes, to create a problem with the reafferents. But equally, a mismatched corollary, if I could say that word, it would help, discharge, could create the same problem, and we're off to the races. I'm going to just skip this and this in the interest of time. So where are we going? Well, I think we're entering a new era. This was the third international conference, 2017, held in Edinburgh, when we could still meet in person. We managed to sell out, which was nice, and had a very valuable scientific meeting, bringing together of different disciplines, move forward, and have on that basis created the Functional Neurological Disorders Society. A quick plug for their inaugural conference, June 19, 21st, 2022, in person or online hybrid meeting. But more importantly, we've got patient organizations now. And I want to credit my colleague Jon, who's been a lot of work with these patient organizations to create a model that's both truly neuropsychiatric, involves the reality of the neurology, but also the psychiatry and the psychology. And we've got sophisticated models. And this is just an example, Matt Butler and Tim Nicholson looking at rates of functional disorders, fairly typical pattern of presentations, complex patients there. But what I really wanted to highlight was the patient view. Actually, the majority of patients believe that there's a combination of physical and stress and trauma related phenomena. They've got a complex neuropsychiatric view. Not all patients, and we see some extreme ones, and we see this, for instance, in the guidelines on chronic fatigue and ME. It's really a result of activism, not stress. There's not a single recommendation in this guideline that's based on any scientific evidence. It's essentially a group of people sat around a table and said, this is what we would like ME to be. Interesting point, however, made by Liv Landmark in this article out this week in a neurology, in a Norway scientific journal, was that, of course, only voices of non-recovered patients were allowed around the table. They weren't interested in speaking to anyone who got better. And this is often the way. Often functional disorders don't appear. There are very few media stories, and they often appear in the media, but often as medical mysteries. And whenever you see medical mystery, doctors are baffled. 9 times out of 10, you can bet it's actually a functional disorder. So I had to speed up a bit. I'm sorry I meandered too much, exactly what I teach people not to do. Need to be aware medicine's about stories, and every generation has its story. I think FND as a diagnosis as currently understood is on a sound footing, and it stands up to Guzzi's test. But why it happens is as immersed in narratives as ever. And when we approach investigation, we need to remember that we've got our stories, same as patients do, and try to stay as equipoised as possible and try to look at what the findings actually are rather than letting them fit with what we want to find. I'll close at that point. I'm sorry I'd wanted more time for questions. I know there are a lot of them. I'm very apologetic that I've left hardly any time. Just credit my research group, but I hope there's been some interest. I'll be very happy to go through the questions and reply to people individually if they like. And yeah, my apologies for poor timekeeping. Let me have a quick look at what we do have in the way of questions in the last few minutes. What have we got here? I'm just picking something at random. It doesn't seem the current term functional neurological disorder is entirely accurate in conditions such as Parkinson's disease that most often include psychological symptoms and likely not caused by a focal physiological lesion. I don't quite understand the point here. I think you can delineate Parkinson's from functional disorders. The tremor in Parkinson's has certain rules, but I may be misunderstanding the question. Somebody's asking about a webinar from a feminist point of view, neatly avoided today. I apologize if you think I've done that. I think my colleagues in our group are actually writing a treatise from a feminist point of view, but I think my perspective I was trying to say is that if we consider these diagnoses can be made accurately, we would predict that women would have an excess presentation because women are far more likely to suffer the risk factors, which is unfortunately largely abuse by men. And I'm not sure that the historic feminist point of view of dismissing the reality of the suffering is necessarily a helpful response. An alternate feminist view is, why don't we have decent services for people who are victims of abuse? DSM suggests there is some distress as the concept of label indifférence no longer seen. Label indifférence doesn't discriminate, we've written on this, between functional disorders and organic pathology. So it was not of diagnostic utility. What DSM tried to focus things on was things that were of diagnostic utility. Distress is common throughout all neurological conditions. It's twice as common in functional disorders, but it's really comparing 1 in 3 to 2 in 3. So it doesn't help with diagnosis. We've seen a significant rise in dissociative conversion disorder in adolescent girls, predominantly epilepsy and tic, but other movement disorders in the last 18 months. This has been commonly cited around the world. And I think the one group who've suffered particularly psychologically during pandemic is teenagers, early 20s, with the effects of lockdown and social restriction. There's good quantitative evidence that their mental health has taken a knock, and a rise in FND is explicable. But I think also there has been quite a rise in discussion of tic disorders in the media, and that you can argue about to what extent that social privation has a role. Ben Lomas, I wonder if any research on whether deprivation is a risk factor. Yes, but it's quite a weak one. But there is definitely a significant effect of deprivation. It also tends to co-aggregate with all the other things that cause risks. How would I characterize the role of complex trauma in FNDs? I think it's a major risk factor. So where complex trauma goes, FND will follow. And I think that's the thing I was trying to say, perhaps badly, that's been ignored from the traditional feminist critique. It's an extremely sweeping statement. Complex trauma is far more common in women, and therefore FND would likely be too. The increase of NFD from neurologists when after years of investigation they end up saying it's functional. Maybe misunderstanding the question. I apologize, I'm not sure what that means, but you know, they're trying their best and it's sometimes difficult. We don't know the mechanism. Are we any further forward than Freud's title of conversion? Yeah, I think we are. I think FND, firstly, is the one that patients prefer. And that's been studied in a number of groups, including ours, and all have considered patients like it. Freud's title conversion implies a mechanism. FND is implied on the basis of a clinical observation and allows studies of mechanism. Is it perfect? No, of course it's not, but we do need a name, and in the absence of anything, a name that patients like is probably the best way forward. Has there been any consideration of long COVID as FND? Yeah, that's something we're deeply involved in research. And I mean, I think long COVID is a complex ship of many etiologies, and there are many different conditions flying under its flag, everything from Alzheimer's disease precipitated by delirium through to functional cognitive disorders. But I think it's important that that's done in a systematic way based on positive signs, rather than simply saying people have unexplained symptoms, we don't know the cause, and therefore it's functional. I had better stop at that point. I apologize again for not leaving enough time for questions and rushing a bit at the finish. I hope it's been at least of some interest to you. And yeah, this is my story and my story of events, and other people would see that story in a different light. At least I hope I've been fair to what the data is that underpins it, even if my interpretation doesn't meet with universal approval. Thank you very much for coming. Thanks for your attention, and safe afternoon, and stay safe for the rest of the pandemic. Bye.